I'm Jason Herbert, and I've lived all over the United States, and I've lived in small town America. I grew up in Murray, Kentucky, and Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, and I've lived in Lake Placid, Florida. And one of the things I've noticed is how susceptible these small towns are to the messages of the extreme right. But I've always wondered why that is. So I invited on for you today our guest, Sasha Abramsky. He is the author of a brand new book called Chaos Comes Calling: The Battle Against the Far-Right Takeover of Small-Town America. And we have a really amazing conversation in line for you today, talking about why these towns are susceptible, what COVID meant to small-town America, and where the battles rage today. So I hope you're ready, because a reckoning starts now. Sasha, I am so excited to talk to you about your book today. When I first saw it on the catalog, I immediately reached out. I was like, "Send me that book. I need to see it. I need to get my hands on it." And then I got to spend the last 3 days with the book and really, really enjoyed it. I'm really geeked out to talk to you about this because I feel like I come from small town America. I felt like it was a very personal story for me as I was reading your work. Something I'm wrestling with right now. But before we do all that kind of stuff, do you want to introduce yourself? And we'll introduce you and start talking.
Sure. My name's Sasha Abramsky. I'm really, really glad to be on this show. I'm a journalist. I've spent 30 years writing for The Nation, for The Atlantic, The Guardian, many, many different places on sort of the underbelly of America, whether it's mass incarceration, whether it's what we do and don't do regarding immigration, whether it's poverty, inequality, and then most recently the rise of the extreme right and all of the stuff that goes into the current moment that we're living in. So that's basically who I am. I live in California. I'm talking to you from San Diego at the moment and really delighted to be spending the next 45 minutes with you.
I'm so excited. I've got the book actually right here. They did a hell of a job on the cover here. Chaos Comes Calling: The Battle Against the Far-Right Takeover of Small Town America. Sasha, I have to ask you the obvious question here. You're not from small town America.
No, I'm from big town England and big town US. I grew up in London, and then when I was 21, I moved to New York, went to Columbia. So no, I am not from small town America, but I must say I've spent a huge amount of time since I graduated in 1994 talking about and reporting in out of the way places. I've been to, if not every state in the country, I think 48 of the 50 states. And I've spent an awful lot of time in just out of the way places that I would never have encountered if I wasn't doing these stories. So, yes, I'm not a hometown denizen of small town America, but oh my, have I interviewed a lot of people in small town America over the years.
Yeah, I get, and for me, that's fascinating because I guess one of the questions I had for you is what attracted you to write this story about small town America in and of itself? Like, why sit you? And the book is largely centered on two different communities, but like, why small town? What drove you to talk about these communities?
Yeah, so I've been reporting for, as I said, for many, many years on all of these sort of undercurrents in America. And let me backtrack. Before I answer about the small town communities, let me just sort of go back to 1996. So in 1996, I was a young journalist. I was living in New York. I was looking for sort of any and every story that may not have been covered by the sort of more mainstream press. And I found this political party called the US Taxpayers Party. And at the time, it was full of like crazy conspiracy theorists who believed things like shutting down large parts of the federal government was a good idea, and believed that vaccinations were a conspiracy, and believed that, the IRS was an illegitimate organization, and believed that climate change was a hoax, and all these things that placed them way outside the political mainstream. And there were two political conventions in San Diego that year. One was the Republican Party one, and the other one was the US Taxpayers Party. So I got credentialed to both of them, and I went to San Diego. I had no money at the time. I stayed in a youth hostel, and every day I sort of schlepped over to one or another or both of the conventions. And the Republican one was really boring. I think it was the year Bob Dole was nominated. It was sort of, standard mainstream kind of plutocratic Republican Party politics. The US Taxpayers Party one, by contrast, was completely and utterly insane, but it was fascinating to write about. And so I did a story for, I can't remember which magazine, but I did a story for some magazine on the US Taxpayers Party. I think it was a British journal, actually. And over the last 29 years, have watched as all of those crazy ideas in the US Taxpayers Party have been mainstreamed within the Republican Party. So, all the things that I was writing about 29 years ago as being so far out there that no sort of, politician worth their salt would go near them, they're part of the MAGA movement. They're part of Trump's sort of effort to reinvent America in this peculiarly irrational, violent, brutalist, narrow-minded way. Now, if you want to understand that transition, you don't go to New York or San Francisco or Chicago to understand that transition. You get out and about and you go to small town America, because that transition is being driven, not wholly, but in large part, by small town and suburban America's resentment of the big city. It's actually very, very similar to the political movements behind William Jennings Bryan 120 years ago, who, was this prairie populist who almost won the White House with this sort of combination of economic protectionism and then this sort of very, very conservative vision of Christianity. And 120 years later, we're seeing the exact same thing in the MAGA movement. And so you have to go to small town America and you have to go to rural America if you want to understand it. So I've done, articles for The Nation, for various other magazines over the last 10 years, really since Trump burst on the scene in 2015, where I've gone to all these towns and all these small communities and I've talked to people. And oftentimes I, vehemently disagree with what they're telling me, but it's really interesting. I mean, if you want to understand a country in crisis, if you want to understand a country that, in many ways, to an external observer, looks like it's cannibalizing itself, which is what's going on today, you have to understand the forces that led to that moment. And the forces that led to that moment came out of small town America. And so in the book, I found these two places. I found this community in Northern California called Siskiyou County, which is one of the most beautiful places in California, but it's also got some of the craziest politics. Really, really right-wing. It wants to secede from California and join this sort of fictional new state called Jefferson. It's full of, resentment of public health ordinances from the COVID era. It's totally pro-gun. It's totally anti-vaccine. So Siskiyou County was one of my starting points. And then the other one is this little town on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, a town called Sequim, which is basically a retirement community, but in the years leading up to COVID, also was riven by these political divisions and ended up with the first mayor in the country, a guy called William Armacost, who explicitly endorsed QAnon theories on his radio shows. And this was, 2017, 2018, back when it was a sort of really novel thing. And, most politicians were shying away from any connection to QAnon. And there's William Armacost in Sequim going on the radio and saying, hey, these guys, they're onto something, we should listen to them. And again, it was appalling. I mean, the kind of stuff coming out of Armacost and his allies' mouths, it was absolutely horrific. But again, it was really, really interesting. And so I spent a long time in both of those areas reporting. And my basic question was, if this can happen in a place like Sequim, or if this can happen in a place like Siskiyou County, could it happen again in America? We knew it happened in 2016, but there was this line of thought saying, we sort of stumbled into it by accident. We didn't know what Trump represented. Well, in 2024, everybody knew what Trump represented. So if he was going to get reelected again with 34 felonies, with a sexual abuse civil verdict over him, with 2 impeachments, with, allegations of tax fraud from his businesses, all this stuff, and with a growing number of his own advisors from the first administration saying this guy's a fascist. If he could get reelected in 2024 with all of that over his head, it wasn't the country accidentally stumbling into something. It was the country very deliberately making a completely insane political choice. And so my question in the book is, is what happens in Sequim, is what happens in Siskiyou County something that's going to be replicable all over the country? And if it is, what does that mean for the country? I think we're finding out now what it means. It's nothing good. It's, I don't know what language I can use on your show, but it's a barnyard epithet. It is an absolute...
You can use all the language.
I can use all the language. It is a complete and utter shit show. There is no other way to put this. You look at what is going on in Washington, D.C. You look at the way that civil servants are being treated. You look at the way that programs are being just randomly cancelled with no due process. You look at the way immigrants are being literally picked up off the streets and bundled into unmarked vehicles and then flown thousands of miles away. You look at what happened with Garcia, the Maryland man who was sent to El Salvador by mistake into a super maximum security prison, and the administration is defying court orders to bring him home. Again, hyperbole, there's no way to get there. You cannot say anything strong enough to explain the magnitude of this moment. And I really think my book, gives at least some kind of inkling of how we got here, of how this great country has collapsed in on itself in this, as I said, this cannibalization of everything that makes it great.
Yeah, I think the thing that really drew me to your book, and listeners to this podcast, people who know me know that I'm from small town America. I'm from a small town in Western Kentucky. Sasha, there's still a statue of Robert E. Lee on our courthouse square in Murray, Kentucky. Population 14,000. County is maybe 30,000. And when I came to your book, I was expecting a story of the South, when I first saw it. And I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about this was this Western expansion of this narrative that I frankly wasn't expecting. It's like, well, wait a second. These things are going on in places that that are beyond the stereotype of small town MAGA country.
Look, this is really important. And I've done a lot of reporting in the South over the years, so it's not that I'm sort of ignoring the South. But if you get a Southern coalition of MAGA voters and everything MAGA represents and all the sort of racial revisionism and all of the, this sort of reverence of Confederate statues and all the stuff that we're seeing now and the hatred of diversity, the hatred of equality, the literal banning of books from libraries, all of that stuff. If you say, well, this is just a Southern story, well, then you get to George Wallace in 1968. You get to a man with a sort of vicious political agenda who's capable of getting a handful of electoral college votes. But you don't get to Trump in 2024. You get to Trump in 2024 when you go way beyond that Southern base of a sort of racialized, exclusionary, very hierarchical politics. You get to Trump in 2024 through swing states in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, but also in Western swing states, especially Arizona and Nevada. And then even in states where he didn't win the Electoral College, California, Oregon, Washington, and so on, there is bubbling underneath the surface the same kind of resentment and the same kind of hostility to multiculturalism and diversity and everything else in the small towns in those communities. And even though, California's Electoral College vote isn't about to swing Republican, the fact that there are millions of people in California who adhere to the MAGA mindset, and the fact that there are millions of people throughout the Pacific Northwest who adhere to the mindset, to me, that's fascinating. And if you want to sort of understand the story of America in 2024, yes, you've got to understand what's going on in Alabama or Mississippi or Louisiana or any of the other sort of classic parts of the Confederacy. But you damn well better also understand what's going on in other parts of the country. Because realistically, it's in other parts of the country that MAGA is receiving its rocket fuel. And if you want to counter MAGA, it's very unlikely that 10 years from now, the South is going to be a liberal oasis. If you're going to counter MAGA, you ain't going to counter it just by going to the South. You're going to counter it by tackling it head on wherever you find it. In the same way, and again, the analogy is messy, but after World War II, when the victorious Allies decided, well, look, it's not good enough for Germany to have been defeated. We actually have to denazify the German society. If you're going to demagify America 10 years from now, 5 years from now, whenever this nightmare ends, you have to understand how to do it. You have to understand the politics in these local towns that have drawn ordinary people into MAGA or into QAnon or into any of these other very hate-filled and very dangerous, in some instances, conspiracy-based movements. And then you have to work out how to turn off the spigot. How do you turn off all of the rumor mills and all of the social media bile and all of the stuff that is feeding in to this MAGA movement at this moment in time? And again, you don't do it just by going to the South. You have to understand what's going on all over the country, and you have to aggressively tackle that at source where you find it. And that's why I went to places like Siskiyou, and that's why I went to places like Clallam County in the Washington State Peninsula.
Yeah, I think you bring up these really, really, really great points about this idea being far beyond, the confines of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, right? And I think the big question I have for you as we think about this is what makes MAGA or the right-wing extremism so attractive to these small town communities? Like, what's the buy-in for these folks?
Well, I think some of the buy-in is that it's an explanatory framework that allows people to make sense of a rapidly changing world. So if you feel you've been left behind economically, technologically, socially, culturally, you feel the world is going in a different direction and it's sort of one that's not simpatico with your values. And then suddenly here's a strongman movement based around basically a cult of the personality around Donald Trump, which says, I have explanations for this. Well, it turns out the explanations are nonsense, but then the strongman says, I have explanations, and if people tell you that those explanations are nonsense, it's because they're feeding you fake news or because they're enemies of the people. So then you build on top of this sort of explanatory framework, you build an enemies list. And enemies lists when people are fearful, and people are fearful at the moment because we've been through pandemics, we've been through economic upheaval, we had the financial crisis of 2008 and all the disruption that went with that. We have had the terrorism attacks of the early 2000s, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan afterwards. There's been a whole bunch of things in the last generation that make people feel deeply unsettled about the world they live in. So when you have a MAGA movement based around a strongman leader who says, look, I have explanations for it. I have a ready-made enemies list for you that says these people are the bad guys who are sort of making everything bad. And then you have someone with the demagogic skills of Donald Trump. And look, I don't like the man. I think he's one of the most, honestly, horrific people to have ever emerged in American history. But I'll give him his dues. He's a damn good demagogue. He's learnt at the knees of damn good demagogues. He was taught speechifying by Roy Cohn, who was Senator McCarthy, Joe McCarthy's right-hand man. By all accounts, he, has read and keeps by his bedside, according to some accounts, speeches by Adolf Hitler. I mean, look, Trump has studied the world of demagoguery very well, and he knows how to talk the talk. So if you come into 2024 and you're anxious about the state of the world and you're paying too much for groceries because of the inflation after COVID, and you're looking for easy explanations, here you have Trump. He says, I got easy explanations for you. It's the fault of transgender people. It's the fault of DEI in government. It's the fault of foreign aid and all this money we give to undeserving people from overseas. It's the fault of Venezuelans and El Salvadorians and other immigrants. It's the fault of Afghans who should never have been given temporary protected status. It's the fault of Muslims. It's the fault of Palestinians. Whatever it might be, Trump has come up with this sort of ready-made enemies list. And because he's good at translating the language of fear in a way that captures people's emotions, basically, it's a very, very powerful political movement. Now, there's nothing unique about it. I mean, look, I was just writing in The Nation today, when we look at outside agitators, at the moment, the current fear that the administration is pushing is these outside agitators who get international student visas and they come to our campuses and they corrupt God-fearing American students and they get them to do all these radical, horrible things. Therefore, we got to deport the outside agitators. Well, it's horrible. And, God help us if the courts actually let Trump get away with this. But it's not new. That's the language Southern governors used in the 1960s. They talked about outside agitators from the North coming in and unsettling all the local African-American population, though they didn't use that language. 1930s, outside agitators coming into the factories and stirring up the workforce with their socialist and their trade union ideas. 1850s, abolitionists coming down south or writing articles in northern newspapers and, again, stirring the pot. This language of outside agitators is a very, very powerful language. And whenever we have a panic, a moment of public panic and fear, which we do episodically in this country, usually there are demagogues there willing to exploit that fear by talking about outside agitators and how we need to punish them. So I don't think any of what Trump's doing is unique. It's very well modified to the internet age. It's very well modified to the era in which, through social media in particular, you can spread rumor at light speed. But the underlying consequence principles aren't new. The underlying concepts aren't new. Trump is just an age-old demagogue dressed up in social media clothing. And that, I think, once you understand that, it helps you to understand why small communities in particular are so vulnerable to this kind of demagoguery.
I want to ask you about COVID. The book kind of begins during the COVID era. This is a new term for Americans of the last 5 years, right? This thing, and it really does feel like it's a checkpoint. Maybe I don't want to say turning point in American history, but it definitely feels like it's a signpost here. And I want to ask you, how did COVID mobilize people in small town America to move them to the extreme right. There was a real pushback against the government during this time.
Yeah, this is fascinating to me. And, when I started work on Chaos Comes Calling, I was actually writing a series of articles for The Nation on this. And time and again, I was encountering people who'd been, quite conservative, but in a sort of mild sort of way. It wasn't all consuming. And then COVID hit, and suddenly they're in these small towns and they're getting these public health mandates from DC or from state capitals like Sacramento and Olympia. And they're one-size-fits-all mandates. And they're basically saying, all right, you've got to shut down your schools, keep your kids home for an unknown period of time. You've got to close down your businesses, again, for an unknown period of time. You can't go to worship in your houses of worship in person, again, for an unknown period of time. Now, these, may have made sense. So I think with hindsight, we can probably say that some of these public health measures, if not overkill, they were cumbersomely implemented. But hindsight's everything. At the time, you had public health officers confronting a deadly respiratory disease that spread extremely easily through populations and that was very hard to detect because a lot of people who had it were asymptomatic. And so you had this knowledge that a vast number of people were going to die unless emergency measures were taken. And so emergency measures were taken. And, they did save lives. We don't know how many lives, but, 1 million Americans died in the COVID pandemic at the height of it. It might have been a far higher number if we hadn't taken these measures. Unfathomably high. You could have, had 5-10 million people die. So the measures were taken, but the measures automatically led to resistance. And in small towns where, the populations were spread out, where there was no sort of urban density, again, with hindsight, it may have made sense to have slightly different public health measures in place in those small towns. But there wasn't. There was this one-size-fits-all, and people got very angry. And those mildly conservative people started getting really, really politicized, and they started listening to a lot of very conservative podcasts, a lot of very conspiratorial podcasts and social media feeds, and then started going to local political meetings. And where I got involved in Siskiyou County, the Board of Supervisors there, the County Board of Supervisors, was made up of sort of Reagan Republicans at the start of the pandemic. There were no Democrats, but there were sort of people who were Republican, but within the mainstream of the old Republican Party. And as the COVID pandemic sort of got worse and the public health measures got more restrictive in 2020 and into early 21, the county swung dramatically right and ended up with recall campaigns against several of the Reagan Republican kind of supervisors and replaced the chair of the Board of Supervisors, a man called Leonard Moti, who used to be a local police chief and had, pretty sterling conservative credentials, but they replaced him with someone who was aligned with the local militia. And what you saw there and what you saw in Clallam County was essentially people coming out of the woodwork in very intimidatory ways, using guns at public protests, threatening public health officers, trolling them online, death threats thrown around all over the place against political figures, against public health officers, against doctors, and a real coarsening of the political language. And things got normalized that pre-COVID would not have been normalized, even in the first part of the Trump presidency. There was just this outrage, this constant flow of outrage that fed outrage, that fed outrage. And it sort of was circular. It was an echo chamber. And the more some people got outraged, the more their neighbors got outraged. And you had a sort of viral contagion. And so you had the real virus, the COVID virus, but then you had this sort of virtual virus of political anger and rage. And as that virus spread, it's entirely possible, and this is something I've sort of written about over the last few years, in the long run, it's entirely possible the virtual virus will have done more damage than the real virus. The real virus, eventually we worked out vaccines, we worked out social distancing measures, we worked out containment measures, and eventually critical numbers of us got some level of immunity and it became a less deadly disease. So the COVID crisis sort of became chronic. But it seems to me what we're seeing with the other crisis, the crisis of politics, is that we had this sort of virtual virus that was triggered in 2020, 2021, and it never left. It just intensified. And so instead of it becoming a sort of low-lying background chronic thing that we could manage, it's become a state of acute sickness for our body politic for the last 5 years, basically. And if you want to understand January 6th, 2021 and the attempted coup against the Democratic Republic, you have to understand that virtual virus that was spreading. If you want to understand the election denialism, if you want to understand the hostility to public health, if you want to understand the completely insane hostility to basic measures like vaccines, which we're now seeing. Again, that's the political virus. That's the long tail of the COVID crisis that's still with us. And I would argue, if you want to understand politics in America in 2025, how on earth are we tolerating the dismantling of large parts of the federal government? How on earth are we tolerating, an economic policy that by any measure seems to be the whim of a madman? How are we tolerating a foreign policy that allies with Putin and goes to rhetorical war, at least, with our democratic allies? How are we tolerating United Nations votes that place us in the company with Russia and North Korea against pretty much the whole world? How are we tolerating the dismantling of US aid, which we know will result in the death of millions of people of HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, hepatitis, and all these other preventable, curable diseases, simply because of the whim of Elon Musk and Donald Trump? So you said I could use any language I like on this show. This is so fucked up. This is like the most fucked up form of government I have ever seen in my life. You want to understand that? Go back to the COVID crisis and look at all of the anger and rage and irrationalism that was unleashed, especially online, and that was exploited by people like Donald Trump and Elon Musk. That is how we got here. And the challenge we face now is undoing the unfathomable damage that these guys are creating in the way that our systems of government and our democracy functions.
I think one of the fascinating things that you kind of reveal in the book, and that's something I've noticed recently as I've kind of perused social media, is the cognitive dissonance employed by the far right at this point in time. I've seen nonstop things talking about how when COVID first broke out, Biden didn't do this, and it's almost like there's a purposeful forgetting that Trump was president when COVID hit in late 2019, early 2020, and then even more specifically, there's all this rhetoric that's coded in racial ideology, employed by the far right, and as you point out in the book, people are actively to know I'm not a racist. I'm not talking about in racial terms. So how do we explain this incongruity between actions and what people are saying about their own actions when it comes to things like race?
I think you're right. Cognitive dissonance is the way we explain this. I mean, anyone, if you were a Martian looking down on America in 2024, and you were looking at the election campaign, and you were looking at the proposals that Harris was putting forward and the proposals Trump was putting forward, or looking at the ways that they talked at rallies, or looking at the ways that they interacted with media, or looking at the ways they debated, or whatever it might be, if you were that impartial Martian looking down on Earth, you'd think, well, there is a very smart, intelligent, articulate person on one side, and then there's an old man raving about Haitians eating dogs on the other side. It would be no contest. I mean, it would, and I'm not even talking about left wing, right wing. I'm just talking about the coherence of political vision and the coherence of political conversation. Instead, what you have is a critical number of people who looked at that and basically were told, well, your egg prices are too high, vote for Trump. Well, egg prices were high, but Trump never presented a policy to lower egg prices. The state of the economy is bad, vote for Trump. Well, in fact, the state of the economy was really quite good. I mean, there were problems, in particular inequality, which I've written about for 30 years at this point. But if you're looking at the raw metrics, unemployment, GDP growth, and so on, economy was doing pretty well, and inflation was actually coming down by 2024. If you just looked at the raw metrics, Trump shouldn't have been in contention. So how was he in contention? Well, then you come to the resentments. People who said, well, I'm not racist, but, and they may not have even articulated the but. They may not have even self-articulated it in their own head. But somewhere deep inside them, there were an awful lot of people who just weren't comfortable with the fact of a black woman being elected president of the United States. If you look at Trump's rhetoric since the election, all of the stuff that may have been implicit even in 2024 is now explicit. Just the racial bilge that keeps coming out, the assault on diversity, the assault on anything to do with equality, the turning of the civil rights officers of the Department of Justice as a vehicle to improve white power in this country It makes no sense. How can you possibly have a civil rights division in a country with the history that the United States has that doesn't pay attention to racial discrimination against African Americans? Makes no sense. How can you possibly have a refugee policy in this country that has banned refugees from almost every country on earth, except we now have an official policy of welcoming in white South Africans? Well, that's completely insane. This is a country which has let in millions and millions of people from all around the world as part of its refugee resettlement program since World War II. It is one of the crown jewels of American policy. It is one of the single best examples of soft power that America can present to the world. We've cancelled that whole thing, and instead, all we're going to do is open the country to white South Africans. What is that saying to the rest of the world? If you look at what's happened at the Naval Academy recently with this attempt to comply with Trump's supposed ban on diversity, equity, inclusion, well, the way it's been interpreted by the Naval Academy is no books by people like Maya Angelou, no books that study the history of the KKK or racism in the United States or slavery in the United States, no books even that talk about the Holocaust against Jewish populations in Europe in the 1940s during World War II. But according to the New York Times today, there are still 2 copies of Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler in the Naval Academy library. Well, again, since I'm allowed to say it, what the fuck is going on? How is the most diverse country in human history now being run by avowed white supremacists? At every level, Pete Hegseth in the Defense Department, Trump and Vance. They're not even hiding the fact that they're believers in the Great Replacement theory. They believe that white people are being displaced by all these other minorities in the United States. Well, that's the policy of fascism. We now have a vice president who went to Europe, snubbed the German chancellor, and specifically went out of his way to hold meetings with the leader of the neo-Nazi AfD party. It's completely unprecedented. Never in American history has America treated its allies this way. Never in American history, except for the 12 years when Reconstruction was destroyed by white redemption in the 1870s and 80s, and then replaced by nearly a century of Jim Crow rule. That's the nearest equivalent. We're seeing the federal government under Donald Trump essentially embracing and implementing the vision of the white redemption movement of the 1870s and 80s and the Jim Crow politicians that followed for 3 generations in their wake. And it's an absolute disgrace. And again, my book doesn't give all the answers to how we got here, but it does give some of the answers. And it does show what can happen and how quickly it can happen when local politics ends up being consumed by these really, really vicious rumor-based politics, essentially spread on social media.
Yeah, as I read the book, and I know you quote her, she's a friend of mine. Heather Cox Richardson nails this, especially in her How the South Won the Civil War. Her understanding of the failure of Reconstruction, of our failure, of the United States' failure of Reconstruction and the years past, and this growing, the storm that happens as a result of this really helps to explain a lot of this. I want to ask you about education here, because we're seeing the dismantling of the Department of Education. We are seeing tons of grants funded. We're seeing educational opportunities in Indian country, which doesn't traditionally receive a whole lot of money. So the money that they're getting is losing this money is keeping tribes down. Like, how do we explain how small town Americans, and again, I've got a PhD and I come from small town America. How do we explain how small town Americans view higher education, and what is with this anger and resentment towards education?
I think the anger and resentment against the universities is part and parcel of the broader anger and resentment against expertise and supposed elite institutions. There's just been this sort of decoupling in a way between one part of society and another, where there's this growing distrust about words of authority. And look, it's good to be skeptical. I'm not saying we should all just say, all right, just because you have a PhD, I've got to respect your ideas. It's good to be skeptical. It's good to, be contrarian. But it's something else entirely when you use political power to try and destroy wholesale especially educational institutions. You can critique the Ivy Leagues, and God knows there are lots of valid critiques of the Ivy Leagues. You can critique the Ivy Leagues without putting a chainsaw to them, or without trying to humiliate them and grind them down as has been done against Columbia University, as is being done against Harvard, and as various other universities. At that point, it starts to look much more like a cultural revolution. It starts to look much more like what happened in China under Mao, or what happened in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge. This wholesale destruction of any institution of education that can serve as a point of challenge to an authoritarian project. And I think if you look at what's happening with the top law firms that are being sort of made to kiss the ring, one after the other, you look at the educational system. Now, there have been some universities that have stood up to Trump and have said, no, we're not going to do this. But a lot of the universities are trying to cut deals because they're so afraid of losing their federal funding. Look, Trump and his people, Project 2025, people like Russell Vogt and the other architects of 25, these guys have studied how to use power extremely effectively. Maybe more effectively than any president in American history, with the possible exception of Franklin Roosevelt. These guys have studied for years and years what they would do if they had the opportunity, because they had all the levers of government. And now they do. They have both houses of Congress, they have the Supreme Court, they have the presidency, and they are running roughshod over institutions that were once thought sacrosanct. But it turns out that a lot of those institutions were sacrosanct by tradition rather than law. And what Trump has done is he's found every legal weak spot, every opening, every place where there's room to sort of say, well, actually, the executive has more authority than we've usually given it. Here's how I'm going to use that additional authority. Every spot there's ambiguity in the way the laws are written or the way the Constitution is written, Trump is using that to expand presidential power, with the backing of 4 or 5 or 6 members of the Supreme Court, which makes it a national emergency, essentially. If you're concerned about the future of democracy in this country, this isn't an abstract thing anymore. This is very much now, where the government is being reinvented in a very similar way to the way that Viktor Orban reinvented government into what he called an illiberal democracy in Hungary. He's right about the fact it's illiberal. He's wrong about the fact it's a democracy. Same thing in sort of Nazi Germany. You look at the speed with which the Weimar Republic was dismantled after Hitler took power in early 1933. Over the space of a few months and a few sort of significant pieces of legislation, the underpinnings of Weimar democracy were utterly shattered. And Trump's studied that. Trump's people have studied it. And there's a very clear programmatic effort here to destroy these key institutions. And obviously the universities are a part of that. Because as long as you have independent academics and independent universities, you've got a sort of bulwark that can stand in opposition. You break down the universities, which historically, in pretty much every country on earth, historically, opposition bubbles up from students. It's where it bubbled up in Tiananmen Square in 1989. It's where it bubbled up in Czechoslovakia in 1968. It's where it bubbled up in 1989 in Eastern Europe. You look at where opposition bubbles up, it hits the streets, but oftentimes it hits the streets from the universities. And so I think what we're seeing now is an effort to sort of preemptively stamp out not just protest, but the intellectual infrastructure of opposition. And that's why it's so dangerous. And you're right, the small towns are sort of cheering it on at the moment. Here's the thing, though, that I don't understand and that I suspect is going to eventually, come back and bite the Trump people in their rear ends. The small towns that are now cheering Trump on because they think, well, this is only going to hit other people, they're the ones who are going to be hit hardest when Medicaid is cut. They're the ones who are going to be hit hardest when food stamps are cut. They're the ones, if they're farming communities, that are going to lose out the most in an ongoing tariff war with China. By almost every metric. Same thing with public health. They may not like vaccines now and everything else, but, people in big cities, by and large, are still going to get their kids vaccinated. But if you have these rumor mills circulating in small town America saying vaccines are bad, you're going to get a lot of kids dying of preventable diseases like measles or mumps or whooping cough. That is going to hit small town America very, very hard. Again, larger states, if we really shred the federal public health infrastructure in the way like it looks like we're going to do, large states like California and New York, it may take a few years, but they'll recalibrate and they'll create their own very rigorous public health structures. The states that won't are really right-wing conservative states like Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, and so on. And they're the ones who are going to end up with the worst epidemics. So, at every level, what's happening is going to boomerang in a particularly savage, brutal way against Trump's own supporters. And I think at that point, I don't know when, I keep thinking this sort of cult is going to break, but at some point the cult will break. And I suspect when it does, it's going to break extremely powerfully, and there's going to be an absolutely astronomical backlash, because what Trump is doing is laying the seeds for catastrophe at every level, and that catastrophe is going to hit his own people at least as hard as other parts of the country.
You know, the thing that drives me nuts, I have a high school classmate I was friends with for the longest time, and we're still, I guess, social media friends, and unfortunately her father is not doing well, right? So she put out a thing recently, I need prayer warriors. My father is ill. My father is going through. And obviously, I'm sympathetic. I don't want to see anyone go through that, right? But I'll be damned if I'm going to be a member of your prayer warrior. I voted for your dad. I voted to cure your dad. I voted to support the science that will help save your father. I voted for all of these things. And of course, she did not. She actively voted, against medicine, against technology, against education. And I don't know that there'll ever be this reckoning, this understanding on this part, that they're actively, and people always say it's like, oh, how do they vote in their own best interest? Sasha, I don't see that happening. I think what this tells you is where they perceive their best interest, which is they value identity and winning more than the results of science or education or economic.
That may be the case, but at some point, look, I mean, if you read the reports today about the scale of the NOAA layoffs, by the end of the next month or two or three, the NOAA is not going to be able to issue regular extreme weather forecasts. It's not going to be able to issue any warnings in any language other than English. There are things going on that are going to impact small town America profoundly. Look, if you live in a city and you get hit by a hurricane or a tornado or something else, it's a terrible thing, but there's a pretty good chance your infrastructure will bounce back. If you live in a small town and you're hit by a tornado and you've had no forewarning because the NOAA has been completely shredded, your whole town can be destroyed. And everything, every business in that town can be gone. Every house in that town can be turned into splinters. The consequences of having unplugged large parts of the federal government are going to become very, very apparent very, very soon. We can go on autopilot for a month or two or three or four. You can't go on autopilot for years. And when those systems break down, people are going to recognize it, and people are going to be angry. They may not suddenly turn Democrat overnight, but they're going to be angry because they're going to, at some point, at least some of those people are going to realize they've been sold a bill of goods by Trump, and that all that's happened is we're paying the same rate of taxes, because we all are, you and I and everybody else, unless we're a multi-millionaire or billionaire. Our taxes aren't going to go down hugely in the Republican plans. We're going to pay roughly the same taxes in 25 and 26 and 27 as we were paying in 24 and 23 and 22. We're going to get a whole lot less services. And the rhetoric will start to change. At the moment, the rhetoric is, the tax man is a bad guy who's just taking your money and we get nothing from it. At some point, people are going to realize we used to be getting something from it, that those taxes were us buying government services. We paid a certain amount of money. We got an accurate weather forecast. We got public security. We got public health so that we didn't have epidemics. We got policies to help us clean up our environment. We paid taxes and we had functioning levels of forestry service so we don't have fires breaking out. We have functional levels of staffing at National Park Service. So if we want to go on holiday in the summer, we can go into those park services. We were buying services with our tax dollars. Now, this year, my tax bill is the same as it was last year. I'm getting far less services. The schools in my cities are being defunded. My environment is being degraded. The public forests are being sold off so that they can be logged. Oil wells are being drilled all over the country in places that used to be off limits because of their natural value. The country is being plundered and the country is being pillaged, and the services that you, I, and almost everyone else who's not a billionaire are getting, those services are being reduced. Now, again, I don't care if you're left-wing. I don't care if you're right-wing. I don't care if you define yourselves by conservative cultural values or by liberal cultural values. You're losing out. You're paying the same amount and you're getting a whole lot less bang for the buck. And when that con is realized, that's when there's going to be a breaking moment. And that's when the Trump cult meets its end, I believe.
Where does Joe Rogan fit into all of this?
Look, I don't know where Joe Rogan in particular fits in. I mean, just on raw numbers, there's no one else in the country with the media reach that Joe Rogan has. But I think it's sort of, you can't just reduce it to Rogan. You've got a conservative media infrastructure that's been built up, that's had a lot of money put into it, and that's become very, very powerful, not just over the last 3, 4, 5 years, but over the last 40 years, since Ronald Reagan shredded what was called the Fairness Doctrine. So the Fairness Doctrine basically sort of said, if you're going to be on air, which is essentially the government giving you rights to airways. If you're going to be on air, you have an obligation to put more than one point of view politically. Yeah, if you air one thing from the Republicans, you've got to air something else from Democrats. That's oversimplifying a bit, but that's basically where it was. Fairness Doctrine was shredded, and you had the rise of very, very conservative talk radio and talk television in the immediate aftermath. So, if you want to understand the rise of people like Rush Limbaugh, it's in that period when the Fairness Doctrine is broken down. And then after Rush Limbaugh, at the time he was sort of seen as the far right fringe. I think if Rush Limbaugh came back to life today, he'd be in the moderate middle, because you have people who are so far to the right of where Rush Limbaugh was. And that's talk radio, it's talk television, but it's also online. It's overwhelmingly online. It's podcasts, it's social media feeds, it's X, obviously, with Musk turning X into essentially a MAGA mouthpiece. So I think, reducing it to Joe Rogan sort of misses the larger point, which is that there's this vast and very sort of well-funded right-wing media infrastructure that reaches deep, deep, deep into America at this point. And especially in news deserts where local newspapers are dying out. So, if you're in New York, you can still access the New York Times, you can get the Washington Post at kiosks, you can get the Wall Street Journal, you can get USA Today, you can get Newsday, New York Post, the Daily Post, and so on. You can get a whole bunch or the Daily News, you can get a whole bunch of newspapers in New York. But if you're in small town America, there's a pretty good chance that your local newspapers have vanished. Certainly the print version's vanished, but even the online version may have vanished. So you've got a paucity of reliable news sources. You've also got a paucity of competitive news sources, because the good thing about a big city's media environment is you're getting left-wing papers, right-wing papers, middle-of-the-road papers. You're getting a whole bunch of contrasting views you can access. But if you're in small-town America, it's entirely possible the only news sources are people like Joe Rogan. Well, if that's the case, then you're sort of, automatically skewing the country rightward. And I know Rogan's a bit complicated. He's not monolithically right on some issues. He sort of veers a little bit to the left. But he has a shtick and he has a worldview. And he pushes this sort of hyper-masculine view of politics and of the economy and so on and so forth. And that influences people, especially young people. And so I think, you're right, that how does Joe Rogan and all these others fit in? They fit in because they filled a vacuum. They filled a vacuum created by the breakdown of traditional news media and traditional news distribution systems. And they filled it very, very well. And, unfortunately, the progressive side has not created a sort of nearly as influential a progressive media infrastructure. And I think we're suffering from that. It doesn't mean they're not there. I mean, I write for progressive magazines like The Nation. They are there, but they don't have nearly the reach of the right-wing sort of subculture media infrastructure, the Joe Rogans, the QAnon, the Alex Jones, and so on. And I think that's something we have to deal with. We're not going back to the old media world. So progressives need to get their act together, and they need to work out a way to create an alternative, progressive media infrastructure to take on Rogan and Jones and all these others.
Sasha, I know we're running low on time. I'm going to beg you to come back on this podcast because I feel like I could talk to you for like another 3 or 4 hours, my friend.
We can do this every week. I'm at your disposal.
Don't say that because I will recruit you. Is there hope?
I'm recruited.
Is there hope moving forward?
There's always hope moving forward. I mean, look, if you look at the darkest days of American history, you look at the Civil War. Well, we had to have hope moving forward that we'd get beyond the Civil War. You look at the darkest days of Jim Crow. Well, some of the most creative civil rights movements and individuals came out of those dark days in reaction. You look at the Vietnam War. It triggered absolutely enormous popular upheaval. There's always room for change. So I think, yes, there's room for optimism, but I think we have to be absolutely clear-eyed that this is not just another moment. This is an exceptional moment, and the dangers facing the country and the viability of this country to remain a democracy are at least as grave as they've been since the Civil War. This is an absolute make-or-break moment. So yes, there's room for optimism. If you look at what happened in Sequim, one of the places that I wrote about, after 2 electoral cycles, a cross-party group of individuals had had enough. They were like, this is dysfunctional, this isn't working, we're not getting local services anymore. And they allied with each other to drive the QAnoners and the MAGA people out of power. So, if you want a happy ending, you can fast forward to the end of my book, and Squim provides something of a happy ending. So, yeah, I'm always a little bit optimistic, but boy, do we have our work cut out for us at the moment.
Well, the first thing people have to do is buy the book, which is called Chaos Comes Calling, The Battle Against Far-Right Takeover of Small Town America. See, I can pitch this pretty well. Sasha, this has been a blast. Man, thank you so much for coming on today. Please come back. I have so many more things I want to ask you.
And I love the fact that you let me swear on air. It was extremely cathartic. So, yeah, I'll come back anytime.
All right. Hold on. I'm Jason Herbert, and I've lived all over the United States. And I've lived in a lot of small towns. I lived in Murray, Kentucky. I lived in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana. I lived in Lake Placid, Florida. And in all of these towns, I've seen all of them fall susceptible to the far right, to the extremism of the very far right. And I've always wondered why. What makes these places so susceptible to the messages of far right? So I invited on for you today Sasha Abramsky. He is a political journalist, and he is the author of a brand new book called Chaos Comes Calling, The Battle Against Far-Right Takeover of the... Try this one more time. I'm Jason Herbert, and I've lived all over the United States, and I've lived in small town America. I came from Murray, Kentucky. I've lived in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana. I've lived in Lake Placid, Florida. And one of the things that I've seen is how susceptible these small towns are to far-right conservatism and I'm Jason Herbert, and I've lived all over the United States, and I've lived in small town America. I grew up in Murray, Kentucky, and Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, and I've lived in Lake Placid, Florida. And one of the things I've noticed is how susceptible these small towns are to the messages of the extreme right. But I've always wondered why that is. So I invited on for you today our guest, Sasha Abramsky. He is the author of a brand new book called Chaos Comes Calling, The Battle Against the Far-Right Takeover of Small Town America. And we have a really amazing conversation in line for you today, talking about why these towns are susceptible, what COVID meant to small town America, and where the battles rage today. So I hope you're ready, because a reckoning starts now.